Chapter 8 of Scottish Reminiscences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Scottish Reminiscences by Archibald Geikie. Chapter 8 Lowland Farmers, Darlings of Priest Law, Sheep Farmers, Hall Pringle of Hatton, Farm Servants, Ayrshire Milkmaids, The Consequences of Salting, Poachers, Called, Sowens out a pewter plate, Farm Life in the Highlands, A Skye Eviction, Clearances in Rayase, Summer Sheelings of Former Times, That Boy of Soay, A West Highlanders' First Visit to Glasgow, Crofters in Skye, Highland Ideas of Women's Work, Highland Repugnance to Handicrafts. The vicissitudes of agriculture have told on the farmers and farm labourers of Scotland, as they have done everywhere else in the British Islands. To a large extent the small farms have been swallowed up in enlarged holdings. It is much less common now than it used to be to find one of them worked by a single family, where the husband, wife, sons and daughters all take their respective shares of the labour. The extensive adoption of agricultural machinery and the replacement of corn crops by pasture have reduced the number of labourers needed in a farm, while the attractions of town life have still further tended to deplete the rural population. These important changes could not take place without affecting the position and characteristics of the farming class. It is for the most part only in the remoter districts of the country that one can now meet here and there with a specimen of the type that was prevalent a generation or two ago. Darlings of Priest Law. 40 years since there lived at Priest Law in the heart of the Lammermuir Hills a family of farmers, Darling by name, who were perhaps the most excellent examples of that type I've ever encountered. The farm had been tenanted by their forebears for several generations, and the occupants were now 2 brothers and a sister, all unmarried. Active, intelligent, kindly, and honourable, they were universally respected and esteemed throughout Lammermuir, far and near. One of the brothers was once riding home from a fair when he was attacked by one of the navvies who were engaged in draining a neighbouring farm. The ruffian had pinned the old man to the grassy bank by the side of the road, and was dealing him some heavy blows when a group of farmers returning from the same fair came in sight and rushed forward to save life. When they saw who the victim proved to be, their indignation rose to such a height that but for the intervention of the policeman, who happened to come up with another large contingent of pedestrians, they would have executed summary justice themselves. Some of the party conveyed the injured farmer to Priest Law, while the great majority of the company marched their prisoner off to Haddington, a distance of some 12 miles, and never relaxed their hold of him until they saw him locked up within the police cell. The brothers were delightful men to converse with. The sister, besides the family charm, had a keen interest in natural history and in all the legends and traditions of the hills. I had come to the district to carry on the Geological Survey there, and on making Miss Darling's acquaintance, found from her that when a girl she had accompanied Sir James Hall and Professor Playfair in their excursions up the Fastney Water. She had seen no geologist since then, she said, some 60 years before, and she would fain hear something of what was thought and said about the history of the earth now. We exchanged wallets, I giving her such information as I had been able to gather regarding the rocks around her home, and she, on the other hand, retailing to me a most interesting series of traditions that clung to particular spots visible to us as we sat in her garden, looking over to the Whitatter and across into the heathy uplands. One of her tales has always seemed to me to carry a strong appeal in favour of the trustworthiness of persistent local tradition. Ever since the time of the Battle of Dunbar, she said, it had been handed down that Cromwell, finding his way barred by Leslie and the Covenanters, sought to discover some route through the hills practicable for his army, and sent out scouts for that purpose. 2 of these men, disguised as peasants, had made their way down the valley of the Whitatter as far as the mouth of a little dell or cliff, when a gust of wind from the hollow blew their cloaks aside, and shoved their military garb to some of Leslie's emissaries who were on the outlook. They were promptly shot and buried, and tradition had always pointed to a low mound with some gorse bushes as marking the site of their grave. Miss Darling sought and received permission from the proprietor, who I think was the Marquis of Tweedale, to open a trench at the place with the view of seeing whether any corroboration of the tradition could be obtained. To her great delight she found, among some decayed bones, a few buttons and a coin or two of the reign of Charles the First. Lammermuir traditions. It was arranged that, after I had taken a few weeks of holiday, I should return to Priestlaw, where she was to have a collection of stones brought up from the river, that I might discourse to her from them, while she, on her part, promised to continue her stories and legends. But when it came back to the Lammermuirs, Miss Darling and one of her brothers had been already laid in their graves. The farmhouse of Priestlaw stands not far from one of the old tracks or drove roads through the hills which, though now comparatively little used, serves as the chief thoroughfare for pedestrians from East Lothian into the Merse of Berwickshire. It appeared that one day a tramp had halted at the door of Priestlaw, from which, as was widely known, no needy beggar was ever turned away empty. The man looked ill, and when Miss Darling saw him, she would not let him trudge any further on his way, but had a shakedown of straw made for him in one of the outhouses. She would not allow any of her servants to attend on him, lest he should have some infectious complaint, but took charge of him herself. It proved to be a case of scarlet fever. The man ultimately recovered, but she and one of her brothers caught the infection and died. With this most excellent woman, I fear much of the unwritten history of Lammermuir perished. She had from girlhood collected and treasured in a tenacious memory of every tradition of the district. She had watched every excavation, whether for draining or building, and had gathered every relic of antiquity on which she could lay hands. The past was a living reality to her, and she found a keen pleasure in recounting it to any one of like tastes and sympathies. Of her, unhappily, it may be truly said that she is among those which have no memorial, who are perished as though they had never been, and are become as though they had never been born. But these were merciful men, whose righteousness had not been forgotten. Among the Scottish farmers, though the general type is actively intelligent and progressive, examples may be found in the remoter upland districts of men who scorn a lad should teach his father skill, and having once been wrong, will be so still. Sheep farmers. Thus a small farmer in Cunningham, in descanting upon the changes he had himself witnessed in the agriculture and general conditions of his own neighbourhood, and had ruefully to make the confession, "When I was young, I used to think my feyther hadna muckle sense, but my sons look on myself as a born idiot." A sheep farmer in the Cheviot Hills had been told that it was useful to have a barometer in the house, for it would let him know when the weather would be good or bad. He was accordingly persuaded to procure a mercurial instrument with a large round dial, which he hung up in his lobby, and duly consulted every day without much edification. At last there came a spell of rainy weather, while the barometer marked set fair. The rain continued to fall heavily, and still the hand on the dial made no sign of truth. At last he took the instrument from its nail, marched with it to the bottom of the garden, where a burn, swollen with the drainage of the higher slopes, was rushing along, brown and muddy. He then thrust the glass into the water, exclaiming, "Will you believe your ain een new, then?" Another farmer, who had also procured a barometer, had greater faith in its predictions. The ploughing on his farm had been stopped on account of the rain, but he noticed at last that the glass had begun to rise, whereupon he sent his daughter to get the ploughing begun again. "Ye're to gang on with the ploughing new, John, for feyther says the glass is rising. Deil may care the rain's aye fa'in," was the gruff response. The hill farmer has been the subject of a good many stories, not much to the credit of his intelligence. One of these men, whose holding was on the hills to the north of Strathmore, had laid in at Perth his stock of matches for the winter. On his wife opening the first box, she found that she could not get the matches to strike upon it. The husband also tried unsuccessfully. The next time he had to revisit Perth, he took the pile of match-boxes with him, and going to the shopkeeper from whom he had bought them, threw them indignantly down on the counter with the ejaculation, "They wunna licked." A Fife farmer. "Wunna licked," exclaimed the shopkeeper in amazement as he opened a box. Taking out a match, he drew it smartly across the side of his trousers and brought it up alight. He repeated the same action with a second and a third, each of which burst into flame as before. "What do you mean?" asked the aggrieved shopkeeper. "By sayin' that they matches wanna licked." "Ay," answered the farmer, "and if you think I can come doon the way to Perth to have a rub o' your breeks every time I wanna licked." Hall Pringle was in my boyhood the tenant of a farm near Largo in Fife, and belonged to an antique type of farmer. He still wore knee breeches, and when dressed for church or for a visit to Edinburgh, he used to mount a blue tailcoat with brass or gilt buttons, a broad-brimmed beaver hat, and a formidable walking stick. He was tall and broad-shouldered, walked with a swinging pace, and when he appeared on the pavement of Prince's Street, he cleared a way for himself and attracted universal attention. He was a great friend of John Goodsir, the anatomist, for they were both Largo men, and when in Edinburgh he usually stayed with the professor, who in return used from time to time to pay him visits at Hatton. On the occasion of one of these visits, Pringle was full of indignation over the postmistress of the village, who he maintained was in the habit of opening his letters. He declared to Goodsir that he would not rest until he got her removed from her situation. The professor wagered him a new coat that he would fail in his endeavour. The task proved more difficult than he supposed, but in the end, with the assistance of the post office officials at headquarters, he succeeded in gathering such unquestionable proofs of the delinquencies of the postmistress that she was dismissed. In due time the bet, with the existence of which the village was well acquainted, was paid, and the new coat duly arrived at Hatton. On the first Sunday thereafter, Hall came to church wearing the garment, and as he passed the pew of the postmistress, he was observed to give the tails of his coat a triumphant flourish. I was once seated on the top of a stage-coach in the Lothians, with a Peeblesshire farmer next to me, who had a sarcastic remark to make upon most of the farms as we passed along. I remember one place in particular where the owner had built a new house and had taken infinite pains to lay out his garden, which he had stocked well with fruit trees, herbaceous plants, and annuals. I had often admired the taste with which the whole had been planned and carried out, and turned to my neighbour to ask if he had not a good word to say for at least that little property. "Oo, aye," was his remark. "It's a bonny bit place. The only thing it wants is soil." An Ayrshire milkmaid. The farm servant changes more slowly than his master. When resident in Ayrshire, I frequently entered into talk with the hinds, as they are called, and found among them some intelligent men. The young women who attend to the cows are often admirable specimens of their sex, comely, well-grown, and strong, with a frankness and good humour delightful to meet with. I was once walking up a hilly road on the south side of the valley of the Girvan water, and overtook one of these girls who was trundling a heavy wheelbarrow, in which lay a large cheese and other supplies for the farm. She had already come a distance of some miles, and was evidently a little tired with her exertions. I volunteered to take the wheelbarrow for a little, an offer which she willingly accepted, and she walked alongside, giving me an account of her farm, her master, his family, the farm servants, the cows, the dairy, and so forth. I soon found that to arms unaccustomed to the task it was much harder to push a heavy wheelbarrow up a hill than might have been supposed. The girl's bare arms were muscular, and seemed fit for any amount of hard work. As we drew near her farm, we could see the master and some of the servants at work in the field below the road, which now wound round the side of the hill. She named each of them, and laughed aloud when she saw them looking up at our little cavalcade, evidently puzzled to make out who the stranger could be that Jean had got hold of. "Oh, look at Tam Glen," she burst forth. "See how he's glowering." I presumed that Tam had a special interest in her, so not to give him cause for jealousy, I dropped the wheelbarrow at the corner of the studding, and went on my way, with the good wishes of the milkmaid, who assured me that if ever I passed that way, she would see that I'd got a good big glass of milk. Salted food. It is interesting to hear these young women calling to their cows, "Prue, prue, prue, chiamoo," a cry which the animals understand and obey. The words are said to be a corruption of approche chez moi, and to date from the time 300 years ago when French ways and French servants were widely in vogue throughout Scotland. A farm servant in service among the hills above Dingwall changed to another farm a long distance off. He was found there by some acquaintances, who inquired why he left his former situation. "Well, you see," said he, "I was not very fond of sailed. But what had sail to do with your shifting? Well, I'll tell you all about it. The maester was a very prudent man, and when a cow died he wad be say alten the beast, and we wad be eating her. Then by and by there was a great mortality among the cocks and hens, and they died faster than we could be eating them. And the master, he say, alter the cocks and the hens, and we wad be eating them too. Well, ye see, it was coming on for Martinmas, and the weather was mortal cold. And at last the older man, the maester's father, he died. The maester, he came to me the next morning, and said he, Donald, I see we're running short of sail, so I'm thinking you'll need to be going doon to Dingwall for some more. Well, you see, I went down to Dingwall, what for, but I was never going back to Alcongreen at all. Occasionally a farm labourer becomes a dexterous poacher, and shows by the ingenuity of his methods how well he would have succeeded had fortune opened a way for him in an honest calling that would have given scope for his abilities. The experienced poacher is not infrequently a successful competitor in games where skill as well as strength is required. In curling, for instance, which even more than golf brings together men of all ranks in the social scale, the sheriff may sometimes be seen playing in the same game with men on whom he has had to pass sentence. There is a story of one of these associations wherein a notorious poacher, who had often been imprisoned, shouted out to the sheriff who had tried him, Now, sure, drive the stain in, gie her 6 months, 6 months imprisonment being an extreme display of the sheriff's legal power with which the speaker had made practical acquaintance. Called Sowens, a former minister of the parish of Kirkmichael in Ayrshire, was resting in his study one Saturday afternoon after having finished the preparation of his sermon for next day, when he was startled with sounds of violent quarrelling in his own house. He jumped up from his easy chair, opened the door, and heard the angry voice of his own man shouting in the kitchen, Nay, nu, ye limmer, though I chase you to Jericho, I'll catch ye. The minister rushed off to save life, burst into the kitchen, and found there, to his great surprise, nobody but the man himself who worked on the glebe, and who was now seated at a table taking his supper. John, what's the meaning of this? What were ye swearing at? What were ye fetching with? Me, minister, said the astonished John. I'm no fetching. I'm no swearing at anybody. I'm only supping they could Sowens oot a pewter plate with this thick corn spoon, and they are gay and fickle to catch. Let me now turn to some recollections of farm and crofter life in the Highlands, as they presented themselves to me in the year 1854 and thence onwards. The house which for some happy weeks in that year, and at Orvilles for 40 years afterwards, became my home in Skye, was Kilbride, to which I have already made reference as the residence of my friend the minister of Strath. Besides his ministerial duties, Mr. McKinnon had a large farm, most of which was rough pasture for sheep and cattle, but with some arable land in the valley bottom, where crops of oats and potatoes were grown. Farming in the neighbourhood of a deer forest entailed in those days some serious trials, besides what arose from scanty soil, tempestuous seasons, uncertain crops, and late harvests. And with these trials I soon came actively to sympathize at Kilbride. The farm lay at the west end of the valley of Strath, immediately at the foot of the range of the Red Hills. These heights formed part of Lord Macdonald's deer forest, and though the deer were not numerous, the fields of oats or green crops at Kilbride and the neighbouring hamlet of Torrin offered a tempting pasturage to them as the change from their sterile granite quarries above. Barbed wire, or indeed wire of any kind, had not made its way to these parts as a help towards the enclosing of land. The fields were only fenced in with low dry stone dykes, which offered no protection against inroads even from stray sheep. Hence it was needful to watch all night and to make noise enough to frighten away the deer. I can remember sometimes awaking before daylight and hearing the thumping of trays, blowing of horns, and shouting of the watchmen, and yet with all this labour and some occasional depredation and loss, when the deer contrived to elude detection, one seldom heard any complaints, and I never in those days knew of a deer being shot or injured either by the farm servants or by the crofters around. Farming in Skye, another source of vexation in the farming operations at Kilbride, arose from a very different cause. Although the arable fields were more or less enclosed, it had not been found possible to enclose the farm as a whole, much of the ground being rough hill pasture. Sheep and cattle were thus liable to stray elsewhere unless watched. Through the lower ground, where the herbage being best, the animals chiefly grazed, ran the only road from Strathherd to the east coast. To prevent the flocks from escaping along this thoroughfare into other pastures, a rude fence had been constructed there for some distance on either side of the road, across which a gate had been placed. Except the scattered crofters, who gave no trouble as they performed their journey on foot, and willingly closed the gate when they had passed through, Kilbride had no near neighbours. On the west side, however, some 6 miles off, there lived an eccentric and somewhat quarrelsome laird. He received inebriates in his remote dwelling with a view to their cure by distance from temptation. If all tales we heard were true, he was by no means a teetotaler himself. It was even reported that he allowed strong Greek to be placed on the dinner table, and partook of it himself, but required his patients to pass the bottle round without helping themselves. We did not wonder that under such a regime, some of them, like Lucio, had as lief have the foppery of freedom as the morality of imprisonment, and that we now and then met those who had escaped and who were walking all the way to Broadford, some 9 miles off, and back again, in order that they might once more have a glass or two of whisky. Summary justice in Skye. Between the laird and the Kilbride family there was no love lost. As the public road passed through the heart of the minister's farm, it was necessary to have a gate across it at the farm boundary wall, otherwise the cattle and sheep would have escaped. But this gate was a dire offence to the laird. For a while, every time he drove that way, he would lift the gate off its hinges and fling it into the loch at Kilchrist. At last the consequences of this conduct became too serious to be tolerated, and the minister was preparing to take legal steps to protect himself, when 2 of his giant sons quietly resolved to take the law into their own hands. Ascertaining when the laird would pass along the road, they concealed themselves among some copse on the hillside immediately above the gate, and waited for their man. In due time he arrived, and finding the gate closed as usual, he jumped from his dog-cart, wrenched it off its fastenings, and threw it with an angry imprecation into the lake. In an instant he was seized by the 2 young men, and after receiving a sound horsewhipping, was sent on his journey. As the result of this escapade, the assaulters were summoned before the sheriff and fined, but they let it be widely known that they would willingly pay the fine 10 times over for the pleasure of thrashing the laird once more, if he ever ventured to remove the gate again. He never did remove it, but he always left it wide open thereafter, and some lad had to be employed to see that it was duly shut after he had passed. At the head of the sea inlet at Loch Slappen lies an alluvial plain, through which a broad stream brings down the drainage of the valley of Strathmore. On this plain the water has gathered into a lake, a favourite haunt of sea trout, which the minister had the right of dragging with the net. The days set apart for this employment were red-letter days at Kilbride. He sometimes hauled ashore large numbers of fine fish, which in various forms, fresh, dried, and pickled, supplied the commissariat for some time thereafter. During my earlier visits to Skye, I saw much of the crofters. On distant excursions, I used to find quarters for the night in their cottages, being franked on to them by some minister or other friend who knew them well. In those days the political agitator had not appeared on the scene, and though the people had grievances, they had never taken steps to agitate or to oppose themselves to their landlords or the law. On the whole, they seemed to me a peaceable and contented population, where they had no factors or trustees to raise their rents or to turn them out of their holdings. In a later chapter, which will contain some reminiscences of my wanderings as a geologist among the Western Isles, I shall give some particulars of my intercourse with the crofters of Skye. A Skye eviction. One of the most vivid recollections which I retain of Kilbride is that of the eviction or clearance of the crofts of Suish Nish, the corner of Strath between the 2 sea inlets of Loch Slappen and Loch Isort, had been for ages occupied by a community that cultivated the lower ground, where their huts formed a kind of scattered village. The land belonged to the wide domain of Lord Macdonald, whose affairs were in such a state that he had to place himself in the hands of trustees. These men had little local knowledge of the estate, and though they doubtless administered it to the best of their ability, their main object was to make as much money as possible out of the rents, so as on the one hand to satisfy the creditors, and on the other to hasten the time when the proprietor might be able to resume possession. The interests of the crofters formed a very secondary consideration. With these aims, the trustees determined to clear out the whole population of Suish Nish and convert the ground into one large sheep farm, to be placed in the hands of a responsible grazier, if possible from the south country. I had heard some rumours of these intentions, but did not realize that they were in process of being carried into effect, until one afternoon, as I was returning from my ramble, a strange wailing sound reached my ears at intervals on the breeze from the west. On gaining the top of one of the hills on the south side of the valley, I could see a long and motley procession winding along the road that led north from Suish Nish. It halted at the point of the road opposite Kilbride, and there the lamentation became loud and long. As I drew nearer, I could see that the minister with his wife and daughters had come out to meet the people and bid them all farewell. It was a miscellaneous gathering of at least 3 generations of crofters. There were old men and women, too feeble to walk, who were placed in carts. The younger members of the community, on foot, were carrying their bundles of clothes and household effects, while the children, with looks of alarm, walked alongside. There was a pause in the notes of woe as the last words were exchanged with the family of Kilbride. Everyone was in tears. Each wished to clasp the hands that had so often befriended them, and it seemed as if they could not tear themselves away. When they set forth once more, a cry of grief went up to heaven. The long plaintive wail, like a funeral coronach, was resumed, and after the last of the emigrants had disappeared behind the hill, the sound seemed to re-echo through the whole wide valley of Strath in one prolonged note of desolation. The people were on their way to be shipped to Canada. I've often wandered since then over the solitary ground of Shoesnish. Not a soul is to be seen there now, but the greener patches of field and the crumbling walls mark where an active and happy community once lived. Reessay clearances. Another island that formerly possessed a considerable crofter population is Reessay. When I paid it my first visit from Kilbride, the crofters had only recently been removed. Many of their cottages still retained their roofs, and in one of these deserted homes I found on a shelf a copy of the Bible, wanting the boards and some of the outer pages. When I revisited the place a few years ago, only ruined walls and stripes of brighter herbage showed where the crofts had been. In diminution of population, the island has changed much from what it was when Johnson was charmed with the society and hospitality of the MacLeods. The old house, indeed, in which he was entertained still stands, but so built round with ampler additions as to be almost concealed behind the wings and frontage of a large modern mansion. The natural features of the island, however, must be pretty much as he saw them. The Duncan, one of the most wonderful monuments of geological denudation in the Inner Hebrides, rises as a truncated cone, the flat top of which forms the summit of the island. This conspicuous landmark is the last fragment left of the sheets of lava which stretched eastwards from Skye across Reessay towards the mainland. Besides the geological importance it has long had for me a sentimental interest, for at a picnic on the top, my old friends John McKinnon of Kilbride and his future wife became engaged to each other. Life in Reessay. One of the characteristics of this island is to be found in the holes, tunnels, and perforations which in the course of ages have been made by rainwater descending through the calcareous sandstone that forms the higher part of the eastern cliffs. These holes open on the moor above, and as they are apt to be concealed by bracken and heather, they form dangerous pitfalls for sheep. In former days, when numerous crofts stretched along the eastern slopes and there was some traffic across the middle of the island, even an occasional crofter would be lost if benighted, or during the thick fog that sometimes settles on these heights. It is told that a woman on her way back from the store on the west side of the island fell into one of these chasms in the dark. Bruised but not seriously injured, she succeeded in slowly descending between the rough walls, and was found late on the second day, crawling along the track below the cliff not far from her own cottage, with her clothes torn into tatters. All over the West Highlands the tradition is current that such subterranean tunnels have been traversed by dogs, which, on emerging at the further end, have appeared without any hair, their exertions in squeezing themselves through the long narrow passages having rubbed them bare. One of the hamlets on the east side of Reessay, built beneath the cliff and at the top of the steep declivity that descends from the base of the precipice to the edge of the sea, was known by a Gaelic name meaning Tether Town, because, to prevent them rolling down the slope into the sea, the small children had ropes tied round their waists and were tethered to pegs firmly driven into the ground. Up till towards the close of the 18th century, it was the general practice in the Highlands to move the cattle and sheep in the summer up to the hills, where the pasture was held in common. One of the great events of the year was this migration to the Sheelings, where for some happy and busy weeks the women and children made butter and cheese, and their flocks gained strength and flesh in the fresh open air and on the sweet young herbage. But the rapid development of sheep rearing in large farms drove the communities away from their summer retreats and began that impoverishment of the Highlanders which has continued ever since. Many a time in my wanderings among the mountains have I come upon the traces of these Sheelings, patches of greener verdure, with ruined walls or heaps of stones overgrown with nettles and other plants indicative of human occupation, but all now solitary and silent. The fat boy of Soay, at the mouth of Loch Scaveg lies a small, flat island of red sandstone named Soe, which when I first came to the district was chiefly noted for possessing the fattest boy in the West Highlands. The soil of this island is thin and poor, the climate rather moist, and the situation facing the Atlantic cuts the island off from constant communication with Skye. The crofters had their little bits of land, and some of them possessed also frail boats with which they ferried themselves over the sound to the Skye shore, and added to their slender fare by a little fishing. But one family owned the fat boy, and the brilliant idea occurred to his parents to take him to Glasgow and earn an honest penny by exhibiting him to the public. They left the island for this purpose, with bright visions of success, but they had no Barnum to take charge of them, nor do they seem to have fallen into the hands of any other showman experienced in all our antique sights and pageantry, which English idiots run in crowds to see. Had large posters been widely placarded, now announcing that the veritable fat boy of Pickwickian fame could be seen in all his rotundity for the modest charge of sixpence, enough money might have been made, not only to keep the family for the rest of their lives, but perhaps to buy up the whole island and establish a dynasty of kings of Soe. But the young prodigy and his disappointed parents had sorrowfully to return wiser and poorer to their northern home. The first visit to Glasgow is a memorable event in the lives of those West Highlanders who have never seen more people together than at a fair or a sacrament, or more houses than make one of their little Clachins. Donald's astonishment at the crowded streets, the interminable array of high houses, and the bustle and swirl of city life has been chronicled in many ludicrous anecdotes. One of these may be quoted as illustrative of one aspect of commercial dealing. Many years ago, a newly arrived Highlander was being shown the sights of Glasgow by a fellow countryman who had now got used to them. As they crossed the street, they saw in the distance a dense crowd of people, and the newcomer naturally asked what it meant. He was told that there was a man being hanged. He then inquired what they were hanging him for, and was told it was for sheep stealing. He looked aghast at this news, and at last exclaimed, "Aachen, Aachen, hanging a man for stealing sheep. Could he no have bought them and no paid for them?" A Highland Fair. The best opportunity of seeing the whole crofter population of a district is furnished by the summer fairs or markets. In Strath, this important gathering is held on an open moor, not far from Wadford. Everybody who has anything to sell or to buy makes a point of attending it, from far and near, accompanied by a still larger number of idlers intent only on fun and whiskey. Old and young, men, women, and children, horses and cattle, sheep and dogs find their way to the stands. Whether or not much business profitable to the crofters was done, the fair to the outside spectator used always to be eminently amusing and picturesque. The quantity of whiskey consumed on these occasions must have been enormous. There was likewise a kind of epidemic of bargaining. I remember the case of a woman who brought a small terrier dog for sale, which she had named Eider, a Gaelic word equivalent to our expression at all. Having sold her dog, she passed on, complaining, "Ja, Neil, Magged, Eater, Eater. This is no market at all," sounding out the last word so loudly as to reach the ears of the dog, which when it came to her she caught up in her arms and sold again in a more distant part of the fair. Another occasion which brought the scattered crofter communities of Strath together was the half-yearly celebration of the communion in Broadford Church. Not only the people of the parish, but numbers of others from adjacent parishes tramped many a long mile to attend the services. One cannot live much in the Highlands without meeting with instances of that inveterate laziness already alluded to, more especially on the part of the men. They have a certain code of work for women, and another for themselves, and that of the women is generally the heavier of the two. This national characteristic has been often noticed. Writing as far back as 1787, Mrs. Grant of Laggan gave what is not improbably its true explanation. After alluding to the Highlanders as formerly fighters, hunters, loungers in the sun, fond of music and poetry, she continues thus: haughtily indolent, they thought no rural employment compatible with their dignity, unless indeed the plough. Hence they left all the domestic and family concerns to their women, who worked the farms, attended to the cattle, and other cognate labours. The men are now civilized in comparison to what they were, yet the custom of leaving the weight of everything on the more helpless sex still continues. The men think they preserve dignity by this mode of management. The women find a degree of power or consequence in having such an extensive department, which they would not willingly exchange for inglorious ease. Women's work in Highlands. More than 100 years have passed since these words were written, yet the usage as Mrs. Grant described may still be seen in operation. A few years ago, in boating along the north shore of Loch Carron, on a warm day, I passed a field where the women were hard at harvesting work, while the men were leaning against a wall, with tobacco pipes in their mouths and their hands in their pockets. I remarked to my two boatmen that these hulking fellows should be ashamed of themselves to let the women do that heavy work under the hot sun while they looked on in idleness. The answer was characteristic and not unexpected. Ye surely wadna hae men doing women's work, wad ye, sir? This habit of allowing the women to do menial drudgery, so characteristic of uncivilized races, seems hard to throw off, though probably it is now undergoing amelioration. Burt, writing in the earlier part of the 18th century, gives an amusing instance of how the treatment of women in the Highlands appeared to a foreigner. A French officer coming hither to raise some recruits for the Dutch service met a Highlandman with a good pair of brogues on his feet and his wife marching barefoot after him. This indignity to the sex raised the Frenchman's anger to such a degree that he leaped from his horse and obliged the fellow to take off the shoes and the woman to put them on. In commenting on this incident, the editor of the 5th edition of Burt's volumes records an instance in which a stout fellow of the very lowest class in Ardgour took his wife and daughter with wicker baskets on their backs to a dunghill, filled their baskets with manure, and sent them to spread it with their hands on the croft. Then, with his greatcoat on, he laid himself down on the lee side of the heap to bask and chew tobacco till they returned for another load. A stranger merely looked at the outside of things would hardly believe that this man was a kind and tender husband and father, as he really was. The maxim that such work, which must be done by someone, spoils the men, has been so long received as unquestionable by the women that it makes a part of their nature, and a wife would despise her husband and expect the contempt of her neighbours on her husband's account if he were so forgetful of himself as to attempt to do such a thing, unless her situation at the time did not admit of her doing it. Manufactures have never flourished in the Highlands, yet the region has many advantages for the establishment of industries, especially abundant water power, and the existence of numerous inlets and natural harbours, to and from which commodities could easily be shipped. Whisky making, indeed, has long flourished, the traditions of the small still, no doubt, making it natural to take service in a large distillery. Mrs. Grant of Laggan maintained that nature never meant Donald for manufacturer. Born to cultivate or defend his native soil, he droops and degenerates in any mechanical calling. He feels it as losing his caste, and when he begins to be a weaver, he ceases to be a Highlander. Fixing a mountaineer on a loom too much resembles yoking a deer in a plough, and will not in the end suit much better. The indignant imprecation which Scott puts into the mouth of Rob Roy when honest Bailey Nicol Jarvie proposes to make the Highlanders' sons weavers represents the ingrained national repugnance to mechanical crafts. In recent years, a few industries have been introduced on a small scale into some of the little Highland towns, such as Inverness, Oban, and Campbelltown. These innovations, however, make slow progress. Possibly the utilization of the Falls of Foyers by a Sassenach company of manufacturers may prove to be the forerunner of other similar invasions, but if the future of the Highlands be left to Donald himself, the lovers of the unspoilt charms of the mountains may console themselves with the belief that these charms will remain, much as they still are, for many a long day to come. End of chapter 8.